So let's get started. This first slide is about why does learning science matter for your school? Well, understanding how humans learn is probably the single most important information teachers need to know and apply to achieve effective instruction that leads to excellent outcomes for all students. Now, most of the learning is benefited by using social structures and environmental affordances that surround a student in the classroom. However, too much emphasis upon social learning, which is really a scaffold, a crutch to help students initially, must eventually give way to students internalizing the what of learning and the how of learning in order to become independent, skilled actors capable of independent thinking and activity. It's also important for teachers to know that the human brain, although filled with differing experiences and knowledge due largely to input differences, functions identically in every human head. If we took all the brains of men, women, and ethnic and racial groups out of their heads and put them on a table, they would all look, feel, and operate identically, unless there was some congenital or traumatic injury to the brain. This understanding helps teachers know that students' brains don't all, quote, learn differently, close quote. The process or the how of learning, but what children learn, and we're talking about the process or the how of learning there, but what children learn is different, not how they learn. And that is a function of their opportunities to learn what they learn. So effective instruction is based on learning science, and it is a critical contributor to excellence in student outcomes. So let's take a look at the next slide. So what then is learning science? It's a large and growing body of empirical, that means data-based observations obtained using the scientific method to produce evidence about how human beings actually learn. Schools that focus on learning help all students to develop the dispositions and skills and knowledge to become truly free, independent, and capable agents in crafting successful lives and careers independent of any environmental considerations. That is what educational equity is and should be all about, giving every student the ability and disposition to craft a productive and happy life. So then, what are some of the best known principles or evidence-based findings in learning science about how human beings learn? Let's take a quick look at about a dozen examples. First, we look at the importance of background knowledge and experience and its effect on learning. Next slide. So cognitive principle number one here is about how students access and use their background knowledge and experiences to learn. When talking with students about a trip to a farm, children will often chime in with something like, well, my grandpa has a horse. It kicked him one time, broke his arm. Another example might be, as I once asked young children in a New York school, where does milk come from? Expecting they would say cows, but no, to my surprise, not one of them said that. Instead, they said, from a store. Thus, a well-sequenced curriculum is just a set of skills and strategies to be learned, but also a set of knowledge to acquire about the world around them and how it works. We need both a well-sequenced curriculum and a well-thought-out body of knowledge that is to be communicated to students. And you see this book that Dr. Foxon referenced just a little bit ago on the knowledge gap, the hidden cause of America's broken education system and how to fix it. So, if schools aren't intent upon growing the knowledge of their students, they are missing one of the most powerful producers and facilitators of future learning, and the single most detrimental deficit that obstructs and hinders future growth and learning in school life and in life generally. So it's important to pay attention to that background experience and knowledge and build it up. Let's go to cognitive principle number two on the next slide. This principle is about how much and how fast we can present new ideas and concepts, facts, and processes to students without overwhelming their working memory capacity in their brains. George Miller in 1956 at Harvard University found that human working memory is the number called the magical number 7 plus or minus 2, which means our working memory has a range of about 5 to 9 bits of unrelated information. Thus, working memory is seriously constrained and can be overwhelmed easily when instruction fails to chunk and sequence instruction into manageable bits. Teachers understand the power in a good lesson is a clear focus on an achievable objection that foreshadows success. Good lessons provide a brisk pace with explanation, modeling, examples, and guided practice, eventually leading to independence in action and thought. That's principle number 2. Number 3 is intended to undermine a long-standing theory about human cognitive development, namely that the brain passes through a fixed set of stages and ages, leading many teachers to say things like, oh, he just isn't ready to learn yet, or he's not ready to do that yet. This gives teachers, parents, and students excuses and often leads to withholding new information or skills from students in a belief that in time they will just somehow become ready for it. What we know is that students can learn practically anything if it is presented to them in an intellectually digestible form with adequate guided practice and feedback. Learning actually proceeds in fits and starts, not in nice and tidy stages and ages. Cognitive principle number 4. This is derived from learning science, and it tells us that not all practice in classrooms is created equal. We now know that spending a week learning the letter S in kindergarten is nowhere near as effective as presenting a brief, well-structured lesson on the letter S on one day, and then returning to that lesson multiple times throughout the year, perhaps as many as 5 to 6 more times during the year in review lessons. In research on this, students who were taught a letter a day with 6 follow-up review cycles distributed throughout the year not only learned the letters more quickly, often by February of the year, but could identify letters more accurately and quickly. Distributed practice helps all learners because even the slower learners get briskly paced lessons with opportunities to receive repetition over time instead of an intensive instruction for a brief masked period of time and then no or little follow-up. That's cognitive principle number 4. Cognitive principle number 5 goes back to our former discussion about limited capacity in short-term memory or working memory. For example, it's a lot harder to remember a string of numbers if there's no meaningful pattern. So for example, try remembering this string of letters if you would. 1, 2, 3, 4, 3, 6, 9, 4, 8, 1, 2, 5, 10, 15, 1, 0, 1, 5. Now that's a long string of individual numbers. Now take this apart and look for patterns. For example, in the first part, 1, 2, 3, 4, we are counting. Then we count in a different way, 3, 6, 9, then 4, 8, 12, and then 5, 10, 15. Now, when we can attach meaning and chunk bits into more meaningful units, it's easier for our brain to process, to store, and to retrieve from memory. Other memory devices like mnemonics in a list, learning like STORE stands for some kind of group of ideas. You come up with a STOP and each letter stands for an idea in a mnemonic device, or even pairing ideas with songs and melodies and rhythm even helps students remember things in a process or remember many new ideas in a meaningful way. Sciences. We're going to turn our attention now to some examples and from examples of good principles in learning science to some non-examples to clarify the assertion that effective schools base instruction on learning sciences and not learning fads or myths. And so you can see here, what we're going to do next is we're going to bring up a few examples of popular educational myths that have misinformed and even undermined effective schools and teaching. Next slide. So this particular example is about learning styles. Most of us have probably heard of this. Over 5 decades of research show very, very clearly that we cannot adequately identify learning styles or modalities in students, let alone teach to them. We do know this, though. The more difficult the learning task, the more modalities or styles we bring to bear upon the problem. For example, when trying to put together a 10-speed bike some years ago, I was having trouble with the instructions. At first, I read silently. As I became more frustrated with the process, I started to read aloud. As I became even more frustrated, I highlighted some of the instructions and then even went so far as to start numbering the instructions. Teachers must not base instruction on such fallacious ideas as teaching to learning styles. Another example, non-example, what we know what is not from learning science. There are several beginning reading programs, for example, that maintain that for students to start reading books, they must master the prerequisite skills of recognizing all the letters in the alphabet and associating these with their variant sounds. In order to show that they know these, students are required to place diacritical marks above the vowel sounds and words when reading them. This is somehow mistakenly thought to produce better readers. It does not. There is no empirical evidence for this approach to teaching and learning and reading. In the one study that does exist about this question, found that there was no difference for reading outcomes for beginning readers who knew how to mark diacritical marks. So if one stops to think about this, you can clearly see that in order to mark the vowel sounds correctly, you must already know how to recognize and say the words. So then this does wasted activity that students learn to read, marking diacritical marks over words, is not really helpful. It doesn't really help much, but it probably will produce a fairly wonderful group of potential linguists for the Funk and Wagnall Dictionary Company at some point in the future. Let's go to myth 3. This one's been fairly popular for some time and found quite a bit of coverage in the popular press. Right brain and left brain has been around for years. This notion evolved out of the work scientists were doing who were studying brain functions in people with abnormal brains, those born without a corpus callosum connecting the two hemispheres, or those who had the corpus callosum severed to control epileptic seizures. There's never been a single study that has been able to demonstrate specialized or localized brain functions in normally brained learners. This is the reason, pretty clear. Most of your learners, in fact, probably all of them, don't have split brains. Again, a fad that led to books like you can see here, Our Unicorns Are Real, a right-brained approach to learning. And this has led to a bunch of interesting classroom practices. And it may even also learn to be used as an excuse for why students aren't learning. Here's another example, myth 4. Novices do not see harmonizing patterns in bodies of knowledge like experts do. This is not, however, a reason to assume they cannot be taught to see those patterns as the experts do. The role of the teacher is to induct the novice into the order of the universe of knowledge and the domains of knowledge that students encounter so they can think like, write like, read like, and act like an expert does. Often this is used as a way not to help students learn. Myth 5, and it's my favorite, everyone learns differently. Does this really make sense? If it does, then we need to stop building and supporting teachers in schools. We should instead train tutors and offer education only one-to-one. There is no single myth that promotes teacher overload more than this one. Just think of it. Every one of those 25 to 30 students needs me to figure out how they learn differently and design an individualized curriculum. As P. David Pearson once observed, quote, "We assess students individually, but we group them for instruction," close quote. When we dig into the research literature, students exhibit clusters or profiles that can reduce the load of differentiating teaching to meet students' needs to a handful of learner groups. This idea that everyone learns differently is simply false and has led teachers to leave the profession in droves because they simply cannot do what this declaration implies. So let's take a quick look at one of the learning principles in action using a case study. This is principle 1 about background knowledge and instruction. Just by way of review, the principle says background knowledge and experience is a basis for all learning, but it isn't distributed equally, nor is it accessed effectively. Next slide. Here is our anecdotal case. Ms. Jarrett, a third grade teacher, is introducing her students to a new story, The Ugly Duckling, in their school's core reading program textbook. Because she knows how much her students will learn is based on their background knowledge and prior experience, she begins the lesson by asking her students to think about experiences they've had with ducks and swans. Next, she shows students photos of ducks and swans and helps students talk about the differences and similarities between ducks and swans. After reading the story, students discuss what they've learned about ducks and swans from the story with the teacher. Unfortunately, Ms. Jarrett is disappointed in the discussion because the students don't seem to evidence much new knowledge gained from their reading of the story. Next slide. What happened? What didn't Ms. Jarrett know about how to help her students access background knowledge or experience to support the reading of a story? Next slide. Background knowledge or experience that is needed to understand a story or a narrative is thematic rather than topical. Ms. Jarrett asked students to access topical knowledge about ducks and swans. The theme of the story, in order to learn from the story, is about a sense of not belonging and not being accepted. Students were not instructed by their teacher on how to access their useful background knowledge, experiences they'd had with not belonging and not being accepted or selected, to properly interpret the theme or message of the story. Next slide. So as you can see, these learning principles that we've just been through lead into our discussion about how organizational features of the school can support all that we know about effective learning and teaching. I hope you kind of enjoyed this little tour de force of the learning sciences and the myths of education. I wish we had more time for it, but I hope you had a great time just kind of walking through this. Again, thank you for allowing me to spend some time with you this evening, and I hope that we'll have some good questions and discussions later.